Maybe you felt at a time like Barbara felt when she had an entire dinner party in her house. There was about 8 people there. She specifically reminded her husband that very day, don't forget, we have a dinner party tonight. So please make sure you're home early so that you can help receive the guests. Her husband had a habit of working late and getting absorbed in his work. Sure enough, the guests arrive, no sign of her husband. And as usual, he comes strolling in about 6:25, late for the dinner party. He had completely forgotten. But for Barbara, what made this so difficult is the feelings, the emotions that were welling up inside of her. She was so angry at her husband for forgetting again, and she didn't want to ruin the dinner party because there was 8 people there. So she's trying to just push down this anger, push down the anger, but she can't help it. And it's welling up inside of her, and she's becoming so bitter. By the time he walks in the door, she just wants to lose it. At this point, she feels like she can't control her emotions. Have you ever been in a situation where you feel like you can't control your emotions? Like if you've ever felt like the resentment or the anger's boiling up, you feel maybe like Barbara felt, where she just wanted to rip his head off, right? She wanted to just start yelling at him and telling him how she felt right in front of the guests. And it gets at that point, right, when you feel like you can't control the emotions, like you don't even care about the consequences anymore. You don't care about who's there and what they're going to think anymore, because you're at a certain point where you just can't help it. It's just like boiling inside of you. It's like bursting through your veins, and you just have to get it out. Have you ever felt like that? The other choice that Barbara felt is that she could just be resentful the whole night. That's going to ruin the dinner party. Her attitude's going to be bad. She's going to be mean. She's not going to be kind and friendly to the guests. She's going to be withdrawn and distant. She's going to make a bunch of bitter remarks. What could she do to control her emotions? And why were her emotions so hard to control? Barbara was a survivor of complex trauma. Emotional dysregulation due to complex post-traumatic stress disorder can be a challenging and overwhelming experience. It can cause a person to feel as if their emotions are out of control. And now this feeling can vary from person to person, but generally it's going to involve feeling intense emotions like uncontrollable anger, uncontrollable rage, uncontrollable irritability, or intense sadness and despair or hopelessness. It could be anxiety, panic, fear. It could be guilt, shame, self-blame. It could be the feeling of being overwhelmed or being helpless. But it feels like in that moment when it gets so intense, it feels like it can't be controlled. Survivors of CPTSD have difficulty managing their emotions. So they find themselves feeling as if their emotions are too intense or too overwhelming to bring the baseline. They have difficulty expressing themselves. Sometimes they have difficulty regulating or difficulty staying stable. They feel like their emotions are unpredictable. And what's worse is even when they're feeling okay, they're afraid because they feel easily triggerable. So they feel like something could remind them of a past experience or past traumatic event, and that could trigger them. And then they could feel like they lose control. They could feel like they're living in the past, going through the traumatic experience again, even though they're not in the past, they're in the present. They could feel like they have a difficulty distinguishing between the past and the present experiences, or they could dissociate. They could go numb. They can feel disconnected from themselves or reality. They can feel like they're in a dream or a fog. They can feel like their body is not their own, like they're on the outside of themselves looking in. And you can see this could cause a problem. Like in the situation with her husband had often said that she was overreacting. Now, of course, Barbara's feeling upset at the moment. She doesn't feel like she's overreacting, but would it be an overreaction to start screaming at your husband because he's late for the dinner party in front of the 8 guests? Maybe it would. This tendency to overreact makes it difficult to maintain healthy relationships. We find ourselves either lashing out at our partners in the relationships or holding so much resentment toward them. We can feel difficulty trusting others. We can feel intense fear of abandonment or rejection. We can feel difficulty communicating in an effective, calm manner. And then all this emotional dysregulation leads to health problems with the bowels, nausea, headaches, digestive, and you can't sleep. Does any of this sound familiar to you? If you know someone who has CPTSD or you yourself have experienced some of these symptoms, it's important to understand that the symptoms can be different for each person. Whereas some can struggle with the anger more, others more with the sadness. But there are coping strategies that can help us. Yes, even if we have very intense emotional flashbacks. Do you know what an emotional flashback is? Emotional flashbacks are intense, overwhelming experiences because they feel like they're connected to past events or past traumatic event. It's when a person feels triggered by a reminder of a past traumatic event. And then unlike an ordinary memory, they actually feel like they're inside the trauma again, when they were being beaten or neglected, or they were helpless, or they were being used or abused. So unlike ordinary memories, it feels like they're there. It's not just something they're remembering. So now they're reacting in a way that to everyone around them looks like an overreaction. But to them, they're reacting exactly according to the circumstance, but it's the circumstance from the flashback. And that's an emotional flashback. It can be triggered by a variety of things, sounds, smells, situations. But it's challenging to overcome, right? Because it can feel very real in the immediate moment. For Barbara, she was having a bit of an emotional flashback. You see, she was frequently neglected and abandoned in her childhood. So for her husband to forget and to make this mistake and to be late, it wasn't just like, oh, my husband forgot and he's late. It was like all of the pain of the past had come on top of her in that moment. She's having a bit of an emotional flashback. And when someone goes through this, it can be confusing, disorienting. It can trigger intense feelings of fear, anxiety, helplessness, instability. And the feelings can be so strong that it interferes with a person's ability to function on a day-to-day basis. Have you ever experienced an emotional flashback? How do we stop this? How do we get out of feeling so reactionary and so triggerable? How do we control an uncontrollable emotion? When we feel so overwhelmed to the point where we don't have control anymore, how can we be expected to control that? Well, I would pose this question to you. Is it really accurate? Is it really true that you literally cannot control yourself when you feel emotional? is it actually accurate to say that you cannot control yourself? For instance, if I give you this illustration, my next door neighbor is physically abusive to his wife. And he says when his wife triggers him, when she says something slick or she raises her voice, he's got to get physical. And he goes after her, grabs her, whips her around by her hair, or ends up hitting her, slamming her into walls. And that's just the way he responds. And so if we talk to him and we say, you know, Barry, why do you do this? He says, I can't help it. I can't control it. See, why? Well, because I'm getting emotional in that moment. When the emotion comes over me, it becomes so severe that I can't control what I do. So what do you think? Should we excuse Barry for his abusive way of behaving because he's having maybe an emotional flashback, or maybe he's a trauma survivor? So perhaps he just has emotional dysregulation. So maybe we should just say, okay, Barry, we talked to Barry. He says he can't control himself. It's a little disturbing, right? Along that way of thinking, then we would have to excuse so many criminals who can argue that they were just in a moment of passion or whatever, and they did something that was illegal, violent, detrimental to another person. So really, it's not a sustainable conclusion to come to say that we cannot control ourselves. Now, how can we harmonize the feeling of being out of control with the reality that we actually can control ourselves? Because in that situation with Barry, you'd probably be the first to tell him, Barry, look, I understand you may get triggered and you may feel upset at times, but you cannot go beating on your wife. So you're going to need a different way to cope when you feel upset. Sorry, Barry, that doesn't excuse you from losing control and from becoming violent. And when we look at it from that perspective, it becomes suddenly simpler to understand. If we expect Barry to control himself despite his overwhelming emotions, then it's reasonable that we can expect ourselves to be able to come to some level of control despite overwhelming emotions as well. So how do we do it? Make a differentiation philosophically, make a differentiation between the emotion and the action. Make a differentiation between the emotion and the action. See, the problem that we have with Barry is not that he was upset with his wife, because people can become upset with their spouse, and that's not wrong. The problem was that he put his hands on her. It's the action where we have the problem, right? Make a separation in your mind between the action and the emotion. The emotion may be, in a sense, uncontrollable. It may be, for a moment, overwhelming, where it will come because it's run by a subconscious system. It is an automated system in the body. The emotions run on an automated system. So even when you're not trying to have an emotion, you get an emotion and you say, I can't control this. But don't make yourself believe that now you can't control your physical body. And your limbs just start flying and your mouth just starts going and your vocal cords and your tongue just start forming curse words and verbal abuse. No. There's a difference between action and emotion. Does that make sense? We have to start there. So it's not wrong for Barry to feel the feelings. But now Barry, just like Barbara in the beginning, needs to stop. So here's a tool you can use for emotional regulation that's even effective when we're having emotional flashbacks. STOP. It's an acronym. STOP. Stands for be still, be thoughtful, be observant, be patient. Still, thoughtful, observant, patient. Memorize it. You need to commit it to memory because you're going to need this. It doesn't matter if you've never had a problem with emotional regulation, you still need this. This is a life skill. Everyone needs to understand how to stop. And so if you didn't have the ability to develop this skill in your childhood, now you can develop it. Now's the time. STOP. So how do we do this? What is this stop method all about? When we remember, be still, be thoughtful, be observant, be patient, it will give us all of the tools we need, all of the steps we need to control ourselves. So take that first one, be still. What does it mean to be still? It means to pause. It means to slow down. It means to quiet the mind and not move the body. Again, to be still means to not move the body. In the moment of being triggered, of emotional dysregulation, you have the ability still to control 100% the physical movement of your arms and your mouth. So, shutty. Close the mouth. Keep that closed. Arms, keep them down. Be still. You can feel on the inside all of the anger and all of the rage and all of the hate and the vitriol. It can all come up inside of you, and you can still not move the body. Now, we're doing this on purpose. This isn't a dysregulated freezing. This is a very purposeful, strategic pausing so that we can meditate, so that we can differentiate the difference between the emotion and the control of the physical body. And you will feel the difference right in that moment, because you'll feel everything come up and you'll have 1,000 different things you'll want to say. But by not doing anything, just briefly for a moment, you're actually going to allow those chemicals to surge through and dissipate a bit. The chemicals can dissipate because that's what's driving us. Is our heart just got a shot of adrenaline? The heart is like, whoa, right? If you feel the heart in your chest, sometimes you can even see your shirt doing one of these things. I can do, when my heart's beating, I can actually see it, right? And sometimes my body's shaking, right? When I'm nervous, I can actually feel my body actually shaking. This is the time to be still. How long? 7 seconds minimum. Give yourself 5 to 7 seconds minimum to just do nothing except breathe. Now, if you want to get technical, we can also blink and move our eyeballs. But the idea is that you want to keep the physical body still. You want to keep the mouth shut, the tongue locked. You don't want to say anything or do anything, because you cannot take back what you say. You cannot take back what you do. It's written in stone. It's etched in the ink of forever, because we can't change the past. So once you make an action in anger, you can never take it back. Once you say something or use words in anger, you can never take them back. So please be still. That's your first move. Remember, stop and immediately go into stillness for a minimum of 7 seconds. This will allow the chemicals to start to dissipate, and then you'll remember to breathe. And as you do that, it's going to start to slow and organize the energy of the brain. This puts you in control instead of the chemicals in control. And this is very important. In order to get good at this, you should practice the rule of 7 seconds, which dictates that you will pause 5 to 7 seconds before responding to virtually anything You can use it in your daily life, even when there's not an emergency or something dysregulating. Just speaking to your children, speaking to your coworkers, your colleagues, speaking to your spouse. Just use the rule of 7 seconds. Well, wouldn't it be rude to make people wait and just sit there for 7 seconds silently? No, it's not rude to think. It's rude to act without thinking. That's rude. It's rude to speak without thinking. That's rude. It's rude to snap, to try to control other people. It's rude to yell. It's rude to be bitter and ruin the dinner party. That's rude. It's rude to storm off and to silent and give people the silent treatment. That is rude. It's not rude to pause for 5 to 7 seconds and to be still and just let the initial surge rush through you and to let the initial ideas and thoughts play out before we give a well-chosen response and avoid reacting. Does that make sense? It's your first line of defense. You can live a life where you rarely regret something you say or do. Do you realize that's possible? None of us can be perfect, but you can live a life where you rarely regret saying something or doing something because you can utilize this tool. You can stop and be still in the moment. Now, again, if you're just joining us, this is an acronym. Be still, be thoughtful, be observant, be patient. So let's move into the next step, being thoughtful. What does that mean? Well, we're not just sitting here like a bump on the log. This is not in your brain. You're not just boop, flatlining. That's not what's happening. We're being thoughtful, meaning we're meditating. To meditate is to process, to think on something, but to pause and do so. So being thoughtful means to think carefully and deeply about something, to consider all aspects and perspectives of the matter. It involves taking the time to reflect on one's own thoughts and feelings, right? When we're thoughtful, we can make an informed decision, a well thought out response to what's happening around us. So what are some of the things we should be thinking about during this time? Well, you want to ask yourself, how am I feeling? Why does this bother me? What are some ways I could respond? Look at life as a multiple choice game, right? Or a choose your own adventure. So you can play out different scenarios in your head as you're sitting there. Well, I could yell, then that could make them defensive. I could hit them, but then I could go to jail. I could be calm and tell them I'll get back to them later. That will put me in a power position. Oh, wow. Now that I think about it, clearly I should be calm. See what I'm doing? I'm walking through and I'm analyzing. And this is how I'm talking to myself in my head as I sit here, and all they see is this. I'm just breathing and blinking. That's all they see. Processing, breathing and blinking. That's all they see. But what's happening inside? I'm having a dialogue with the self. That is meditation. So I'm saying, okay, now here's how do I feel? Well, I feel a little angered by that. Something about that statement bothers me. What bothers me about that statement? Oh, you know what? They're not considering my feelings. Yeah. What else can I think about? How about the other person's perspective? Well, why would they say something that doesn't consider my feelings? Well, perhaps they're trying to express their feelings. Oh, yeah. Well, what are their feelings? Well, I don't know for sure, but based on what they're saying and based on the way they're acting, they seem to be angry and they feel like I've ignored them. Okay. Yeah, I can understand that. I guess I could have communicated more about that certain situation. So maybe I should really tone down my response because I have to be cognizant or understanding of their viewpoint in the matter. Right? Now, how much better does our response get when we're able to process how we feel and then take into tandem how they feel? And then we bring in, okay, what's a a bird's eye view of this? What's a bystander's view? Or if God were watching this, what would he say about the matter? Now we can become even more sophisticated in our thinking. Now we're actually being spiritual about the confrontation. Wow, actually, he would say you need to focus on your purpose. Don't worry about controlling other people. He would say communicate well, but be efficient and concise, right? As you process all of this information, although the other person is waiting, what you're not doing is something you regret. What you're not saying is something you're going to regret saying. You're giving yourself the time to think it out. That's being thoughtful. What's the next step? Be observant. Be observant of what? Well, being observant means that you're paying close attention to one's surroundings, the people, the events within them. It involves noticing the details and the subtle changes and being aware of the emotions and the behaviors of others, yes. But we're not talking about being hypervigilant. We are talking about being observant. Being observant helps us to be aware, to observe, that is to take in information of ourselves, how we're feeling, as well as them and how they're feeling, right? So we're being observant, not just of what they're doing and like hypervigilant, like, oh my God, how do they feel? What are they going to do? But we're being observant also of ourselves, right? What's important about being observant is remembering not to be judgmental of yourself, not to be overly harsh or critical in your thinking. You see, when we were doing the thought process in the be thoughtful step, all of that was self-talk. We want to observe our own self-talk and make sure that our self-talk is skewed toward the positive. That's an important part if you're taking notes. You want to observe your self-talk, not judge yourself, but observe your self-talk. Make sure it's skewed toward the positive. That's what's upbuilding, what's propitious, what's beneficial for the self. It's important that we regulate that. So observe your thoughts, observe your feelings, observe the surroundings and the other person as well. But make sure that what you're saying to yourself is something that's going to build itself up. For example, hypervigilance is assuming all the worst. These people are looking at me. They're probably thinking I'm dumb. They're probably thinking I'm stupid. They're probably thinking I'm fat. They're probably thinking I'm ugly. They probably. That's not proper observance. Observance is observing the actual situation and skewing toward the positive, the benefit of the doubt. I don't know exactly what they're thinking, but they seem to be upset. Perhaps I am partially at fault, but I also can observe in myself that I don't feel any ill will toward them. I don't have any bad motive. That's being observant. You see the difference? We're skewed toward the negative and the fear-based way of thinking in hypervigilance. In being observant, we're looking at the actual situation and we're thinking from a standpoint of being kind to the self, not so judgmental. Being observant in general can help us to improve our situational awareness, and it can help us to ground ourselves if we're having an emotional flashback. So for instance, if you're being observant, then you're not stuck in the past, but you're actually living in the present. And that's what being observant can do. So it really comes down to really basic things like, where am I right now? What year is this? How old am I? That's a part of being observant. I'm not at my mom's house anymore. I'm no longer in prison or being kidnapped. I'm no longer in those old situations. I'm not in an abusive relationship. This is my new spouse or my friend or my colleague. This person is not evil. This person does not have bad intentions. That's a part of being observant. realizing where you are right now in the stream of time, being present in the moment, present in the present. Not being too caught up in everything that you're fearing in the future. That's not being observant, that's hypervigilance. Not being too caught up in everything that happened in the past, right? Just being here right now, right in the moment. Don't assume that you can predict how someone's going to respond. Stay present right here. Where am I? What time is it? What are we doing? And then finally, we have to be patient. What does it mean to be patient? Being patient means to be able to tolerate discomfort and suffering. That's what it means to be patient. It means to accept and tolerate delays, difficulties, challenges without becoming frustrated and upset. That's what it means to be patient. To tolerate discomfort and suffering. Why is it important for us to have the ability to tolerate discomfort or a delay or a difficulty or a challenge without becoming frustrated and upset? Well, imagine if the whole world could do that. There would be no more road rage, right? Probably less wars. A lot of violence would be eliminated if we had more patience. No wonder it's said that patience is a virtue. This is the quality that's superlative to acquire. And if you're on a spiritual journey, make this a priority to develop patience. You're going to need it. Being patient involves being calm and steady in our attitude. And it involves being willing to wait for things to unfold in their due time. It's no secret that being patient reduces our stress and our anxiety. It improves our relationships. It makes us more attractive. It helps us to achieve our long-term goals. And again, if we're patient, then we're not being harsh and judgmental of the self. So remember, when it comes time to handle an emotionally dysregulated moment or to deal with an emotional flashback, stop. It's a simple tool, but there's so much there. The only part you have to remember is the acronym. Be still, be thoughtful, be observant, be patient. Just running through those words in your brain automatically will start to regulate your emotional state and bring you back to present. That's what Barbara did. In the past, she would have either screamed and blown up at her husband or taken the other route, just been bitter the whole night and just let the party get ruined. Or she would have dissolved into tears and let the party get ruined. But this time, Barbara took a moment. In her case, she stepped out of the room once her husband came home because she noticed how she was feeling. She didn't do so in a confrontational way. She didn't storm out. She just put her napkin down and walked out, went in the bathroom and hit the steps. Be still, be thoughtful, be observant, be patient, she told herself. And she sat there still. And she noticed her ability just to stand there and her ability to get up and walk away without acting in a way that showed any emotion was very powerful. It was already progress. And that encouraged her. She started to think about how much her husband does for the family. She was being thoughtful. Although her husband was imperfect, he was a good provider. And she wished that he valued this dinner party more, but it was something that she could talk to him about later. And she realized that when she thought about it. it would be better for her to go out, greet him, and move on with the evening rather than to make a big issue of it. She was observant of the moment. She realized this was not her past where she's being abandoned. Her husband was not an abandoner. And she decided to patiently show kindness to her husband. And so she came out of the bathroom when she was ready. And she went up to her husband. She gave him a hug and a kiss, like as if he had come home at the right time. Her husband felt guilty. And he immediately started apologizing to her. And she said, "That's okay. Don't worry about it. We can talk later." And she went right back to the dinner party, but she felt so good when she saw that her husband did feel bad. Admittedly, it made her feel a little bit better, but it was really that she didn't overreact. She felt in control again. So hopefully you, like Barbara, will utilize this tool and remember to stop when you feel emotionally dysregulated. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. We're going to talk more about complex post-traumatic stress disorder and in our complex trauma discussion group on Wednesday at 7 Central, 8 Eastern.